So in January 1975, the famous jazz pianist Keith Jarrett was invited to play a special improvisational concert at the Köln Opera House in Germany. The promoter of the concert was a young 17-year-old woman named Vera. She'd organized this late-night concert for a special celebrity guest of 1,400 people. Tremendously excited about having put this event together, she introduced Jarrett to the piano on the afternoon before the concert. Jarrett went over and he played a few notes, and then he played some more notes, and then he walked away from the piano over to his manager. Then with great urgency, his manager went over to Vera and said, "Unless you change this piano, Keith isn't going to play the concert. It's awful." The piano had sticking notes. It wasn't in tune, and the pedals didn't work properly, and it had a tinny tonality that Keith felt would make his music sound terrible. Vera was dumbstruck. That was the Opera House piano. But what she hadn't realized was that it was their rehearsal piano and not meant for performance. Keith left the stage and went out into the rain to go sit in his car. And Vera knew it was going to be impossible to find another piano at this late stage, but she at least found a piano tuner to come in. And then she went outside in the pouring rain and stood in front of Keith's car, desperately begging him to come inside and give it a chance. He looked at this bedraggled teenager who had never before done this and put her all into making this event happen and said, "Never forget, only for you." And so a few hours later, Jarrett did play at the Opera House before a huge audience. And he sat down at the unplayable piano and began. Very quickly, the music took on an otherworldly quality. Jarrett avoided the tinny upper registers and stuck to the middle of the keyboard and created a whole different kind of unique, magical sound. The audience was mesmerized and loved it, and Keith himself seemed to be interestingly transported by his different kind of playing. That night's concert was recorded, and it became the best-selling piano album and the best-selling solo jazz album in history. Now, Keith Jarrett was handed a mess. He embraced it reluctantly. He found deep inner resources, and that transformed the experience, and it soared into infamy. How often do we turn away from challenges, feeling like they're too great to overcome? How often do we feel like giving up or running away in the middle of a difficult or messy situation, when things feel intractable or impossible? And yet, it's precisely when we're faced with adversity or obstacles that we often rise to the occasion, if not above it. If we're just willing to stick in there, if we're willing to remain in the discomfort, being faced with challenges requires us to think outside of the box, to step beyond our comfort zone, and to get creative and do things differently. The infamous composer Ludwig van Beethoven was completely deaf by his mid-40s, around the year 1816. He could no longer perform publicly or carry on spoken conversations. Many felt deeply sorry for him going deaf and thought the great musician's career was over. Ludwig himself was on the verge of suicide after struggling with his increasing deafness for over 20 years. Understandably, he was deeply depressed and distraught. He was a musician, after all, losing his hearing. Yet Beethoven is said to have composed his most powerful, tremendous music, his Ninth Symphony, the choral symphony, as well as other seminal works after he'd gone completely deaf. According to musicologists, Beethoven's deafness allowed him to enter a much deeper inner world. Not being able to hear, he was less distracted by outside sounds and intrusions. And because he was able to hear all the music in his head, he was able to create music that was even more powerful than any he'd written before. And his challenge brought forth even deeper reserves of creativity and genius. Hard times can be unexpected blessings. They can summon creativity and resources that wouldn't have had to emerge were we not facing some kind of hardship. Things that disrupt us can help us solve problems, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. We usually believe that they get in the way. We often resist and struggle mightily. Yet if we hang in there and stay with the discomfort in the tragic gap, as theologian Parker Palmer likes to call it, unexpected answers and creative solutions may emerge. Just this week, Muslims began their holy month of Ramadan. At our interfaith gathering last week, a Muslim cleric explained to us what it involves. Now, as many of you know, Ramadan is a month of fasting and focusing intently on spiritual practice. Muslims fast from dawn to dusk, which is especially difficult at this time of year when we're approaching the summer solstice. And then they deny not only food but water as well for the entire daylight hours. They break their fast each evening after the sun goes down and share a feast called iftar. In many Muslim countries, there are public celebrations of iftar in town squares with free meals on the night of Ramadan. Now, just like the Prophet Muhammad broke his fast 1400 years ago, iftar begins with prayers at sunset and then a sip of water and a few dates, followed by a lot of late-night feasting. Meanwhile, during the day, Muslims are encouraged to spend more time in prayer and reflection. And our interfaith friends were telling us last week that the first week is particularly hard as they get into this new rhythm. And after that, they say it gets easier. But this intentional month of restraint and deprivation is meant to disrupt people's ordinary way of being, their habits, their materialism, and their mindlessness throughout life during the other 11 months of the year. Fasting is seen as a spiritual and physical detoxification. It's a way to remind them of the suffering of others, and it's a time to focus on feeding the hungry and giving to the poor. This challenge is meant to help elevate them in their compassion for others and deepen their spiritual connection. And apparently it does this. Despite the challenge that Ramadan presents, my Muslim friends relish this time to experience new revelations, creative generation, and a much deeper connection with their spiritual life. Jonah Lehrer, in his best-selling book, Imagine How Creativity Works, suggests a typical flow of creative problem solving. Now, initially, we examine a problem analytically. We try to think our way to a solution. Now, this is our left-brained logical side, trying to work things out. But then if we don't have success with this approach, we might get frustrated or we might give up. But sometimes when we least expect it, often when we're doing something else completely, we'll have a flash of insight or an aha relating to our problem. Now, that kind of breakthrough can't be forced. Often these insights are generated during times of relaxation, such as a warm shower, meditation, walking, sleep, or calm, repetitive activities like bicycling. Conversely, too many stimulants, too much input, may reduce the chance for inspiration and insights to arise. So if you've been struggling with something for a while and your logical, analytical thinking hasn't been able to figure out the problem, the recommendation is to disrupt that pattern by doing something relaxing or completely different. Lara suggests that the breakthrough is usually generated in the right brain, which is linked to more big picture thinking and creative inspiration. And the breakthrough can be followed by a period of right brain activity in which the new idea can be fleshed out. Now, this process of struggle and inspiration often happens for me, I confess, during sermon writing. Now, I intentionally have my work week structured such that, to allow for this, actually. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I have highly stimulating 12 to 13-hour days with back-to-back meetings requiring much left brain organizational thinking. And often on Wednesday nights, I'll go to bed having absolutely no idea what I'm going to preach about in my sermon the coming Sunday. Sometimes I'll meditate before going to sleep and ask for insight to come during my dream time or in early waking hours. And then on Thursday mornings, I intentionally allow myself to emerge from my sleep state directly into sermon musing and crafting without talking to anyone. Sometimes I'll even sit and write in a dark closet to avoid outside stimulation, even daylight or any kind of distraction. I don't answer emails, phone calls, or texts first thing because that would put me in my left brain logical problem-solving brain. Instead, I allow myself to write or muse or research sermon ideas. But if I allow normal stimulation to enter that time and think, oh, I'll just quickly respond to that email or answer that text, I'm quickly thrown off. And it's much harder then for inspiration to arise. And I must find inspiration week after week. So this is why you're less likely to hear back from me on Thursdays, or it might take a little while. Such creativity must be invited and given space. The writer Elizabeth Gilbert, in her book Big Magic, talks about the vital need for space and quiet to allow inspiration to arise. And there are times, frankly, when I simply can't access my creativity and I stare at the blank page, uninspired. And then I go through the arduous stages of left brain analysis, trying to force something to come. And then when nothing arises or very stilted writing emerges, I may get nervous and I'm not going to figure out what to say before Sunday, and I'm really not good company at all. Thursday or Friday might fly by as I deal with other ministry matters, and all the while I'm feeling anxious and blocked and afraid. I'm not going to have a sermon by Sunday. What will I do? And then meanwhile, it helps to bat around ideas with my husband and with friends, and all the time I'm marinating. I'm marinating on possibilities, in discomfort, in questions and uncertainty. And then, miraculously, by Saturday at the latest, something does come to me. Some kind of an aha, and then I write madly. Now, after some years of doing this, I'm glad I've started to trust that creative inspiration will arise out of the challenge of having to create, write, direct, and speak in a new production every week with no rehearsal, I might add. Did you have any idea that I go through this creative torment and progression each week? All those stages of information collection and analysis, frustration and sometimes dread, followed by inspiration and flow. Well, now you know my deep, dark secret. This is also why annual study leave is so important for ministers. It's a time when we can freely muse on ideas, read uninterrupted, and get inspired without the day-to-day administrative demands of ministry. It's a time for right-brain creative thinking to be able to envision worship topics and church ideas for the coming year. And it's invaluable to my ministry. It allows space for inspiration and creativity to arise, which, my friends, helps me to be a better minister to you all. Now, according to Jonah Lehrer, many corporations are now intentionally including visioning time and opportunities for collaboration in their corporate culture. In fact, some companies even encourage their employees to take breaks and change their focus through naps, walks, coffee breaks, chats, and even daydreaming. Many of you are familiar with Pixar animation studios, intentionally designed by Steve Jobs, and it's a living laboratory for creativity. Management deliberately incorporates areas of fun and collaboration, such as a large atrium with beautiful plants and snacks where employees can hang out, talk, and exchange ideas. Mixing opinions among new and old employees can create an environment rich for creativity. And the CEO of Pixar, Ed Catmull, says, shared information generates new knowledge. Hoarded information leads to stagnation. So collaboration and exchanging ideas in a non-hierarchical way is vital for creative inspiration, he claims. His book, Creativity, Inc., Overcoming the Unseen Forces That Stand in the Way of True Inspiration, is an encouraging examination of this famous company and how it generates creativity in its employees through unconventional means. In fact, some of you may know the story of how the iPhone came to be. Apparently, Steve Jobs and a lot of the Apple top brass were early for a meeting and started talking about how much they hated their cell phones. Now, Jobs, ever the perfectionist, just hated flip phones. He thought they just sucked, in his words, and were terrible pieces of junk. Everyone in the room was in agreement, and they all had a good gripe until Steve said, wait a minute, what if we made a cell phone that didn't suck? What would that look like? The conference table came alive, and people started shouting, touch screens, contacts sync easily, make it an iPod for music. And the rest is history. The top secret project began, and people built a really cool cell phone that didn't suck. Apple went from a company that primarily made computers to one that now gets around 70% of its income from the iPhone. And all of that creativity and innovation came because of an obstacle. Now, Lehrer takes this creativity research around disruption even further. Apparently, when a group of friends or people who've known each other for a while gather together and try and solve a problem or come up with new ideas, they naturally enjoy collaborating, but they're much less likely to be innovative than a group that also includes strangers. The disruption and the discomfort that a stranger brings into a familiar group, though it may be challenging for the group, ends up allowing that group to come up with more creative solutions. And I bring that up because today we welcome 6 new members into our congregation. And not only do they bring their unique personalities and talents here, but they give us an opportunity to understand this community with new eyes. We can see it on our committees too. Bringing new members into our meetings, we get new perspectives and ideas that further our thinking. It happened just this week in our board meeting. Now, it can be uncomfortable as they challenge the status quo and hold a mirror up to our settled patterns. But more often than not, they provide perspectives and disruptions that allow fresh thinking, new ideas, and even breakthroughs. I remember when I arrived here, I had an outsider's perspective and was able to see the congregational system very clearly, what was working well and what needed some more adjustments. But as I've become more entrenched in the system, I so appreciate when newcomers join us because they similarly bring us fresh points of view. They see things in ways old-timers can't. So a constant influx of new ideas, new personalities, new perspectives helps this community grow not only in numbers, but also in resilience, in creativity, and innovation. So I invite us all to sit with our discomfort when things change. Acknowledge the challenge with self-compassion, and then welcome with open arms the creativity that helps this community constantly regenerate. To close, I share the words of Flash Rosenberg, who is a Guggenheim Fellow in the Creative Arts, an artist, a photographer, writer, and performer. She says, every creative journey begins with a problem. It starts with a feeling of frustration. We have no idea what to do next, but before there is a breakthrough, there has to be a block. It's only after we stop searching that the answer might arise. So my friends, the next time you're facing a struggle, a failure, or a seemingly insurmountable problem, I invite you to trust that if you give your brain and being enough space, you may emerge with an aha or a creative solution. Welcome struggle as the grist that may help you mill new ideas. See challenge as an opportunity for spiritual or creative transformation. Beethoven, Keith Jarrett, and Steve Jobs are all good inspiration for this. But I invite us to remember that we can all have access to creative thinking from intractable problems. Find your quiet closet. Change your habitual patterns. Trust and await inspiration. May it be so.